Welcome to Bobancha. This land is and continues to be indigenous lands. Today, the land holds more visitors, and we want to recognize some receipts on how that happened. Bobancha went through and put eyes on the gate to a bunch of sources documenting the systems of occupation. Here are some shout-outs to that process. Shout out to the people who blew up the spot. Shout out to Anton de Alimonos, a Spanish navigator for Ponce de Leon, Hernando Cortez, and Columbus, who described a strong eastward ocean current in 1513, which would later be known as the Gulf Stream. Shout out to Alonso Alvarez Pinedo, a Spanish conquistador/cartographer who did a boat trip and published the first European map expressing the Gulf of Mexico as a gulf in 1519. Shout out to Doroteo Teodoro and an unnamed enslaved man who was, quote, assigned to Teodoro through the buddy system, who, in the early squirrel season of 1528, insisted on leaving the boat and going on shore with an indigenous hospitality team in Mobile Bay. Why did Doroteo Teodoro want to leave the boat, and why had he put someone else's fate in with his choice was never explained. Neither of them were ever seen again. But with this feat, the unnamed man and Teodoro are the first accounts of European explorers stepping into the Mississippi Delta. Shout out to Teodoro's expedition captain, Penafila de Narvaez, and his crew on the Penjota, who landed somewhere around Fouchon 4 days later and witnessed an indigenous-controlled marsh burn. Shout out to Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca for writing an absolutely wild and partially unbelievable account of this whole quest. Shout out to Hernando de Soto, who popped into the Delta village he labeled as Cagalta for a visit in the snowball season of 1543. When de Soto announced himself as the, quote, child of the sun and demanded loyalty and support from the village leader, the local leader said, nah, and popped off, telling de Soto to put some respect on his name with the following clapback. As to what you say of being the son of the sun, if you will cause him to dry up the great river, I will believe you. As to the rest, it is not my custom to visit anyone. Rather, all whom I have ever heard come to visit me, to serve and obey me, to pay me tribute, either voluntarily or by force. If you desire to see me, come where I am. If for peace, I will receive you with special goodwill. If for war, I will await you in my town. But for neither you nor any man will I set back 1 foot. After this, the whole village squatted up like the children of the Southern death cult they were and proceeded to paddle 50 canoes deep after De Soto and his squad for 3 days down the Mississippi River, pelting them with arrows and yelling loudly. Shout out to Henry de Tonti, who toted literally every explorer around and also found some time to write some good notes about it. Shout out to Jesuit missionary Jacques Marquette for exploring the lower Mississippi Valley in 1681, where he stopped around 400 miles from the Gulf, around Rosedale, Mississippi. Shout out to René Robert Cavier Sieur de la Salle, a fur trader, ex-Jesuit missionary who went down to visit Venice, Louisiana, and put a cross up, shot some guns, and declared it for France in the crawfish season of 1683. Shout out to France's boundless ability to build nations on complete trust when it's convenient. France stated that everything that came through the mouths of the Mississippi River belonged to Louis XIV's France because of La Salle. That this whole river basin was claimed by some dude in 2 sticks, quote, all by the virtue of a feeble human voice, inaudible at a half a mile, with absolutely no documentation is pretty wild. Also, records of La Salle actually doing this are shifty from the jump. IMO, no one who has actually been to Venice would write about Venice the way La Salle does. Later adventurers like Paul Deroux would actively throw shade on La Salle's accounts as he passed through the places La Salle claimed to have been. We really do not have much solid documentation of La Salle's triumph. and we've just kind of taken the explorer at his word. Secondary source documentation of the trip was only published in 2003 when a copy of a journal someone else wrote was located in Austin, Texas. It feels like the only reason LaSalle's claim was taken seriously was because it was convenient for France, who had just started a war with Spain, and the claim helped in the fight. Shout out to Quebecois Jesuit missionary Jacques-François Lesueur for documenting the process of the Calumet sometime in 1685. He acknowledged the process as a process of peace between nations, and also labeled it as a cult of which Christians should not partake. With that, he pretty much said the whole continent's process of diplomacy was null and void to the church. Shout out to the Franciscan priests who came down with pretty much only vibes to the Caddo around the Natchez River in 1690 and subsequently spread disease that decimated their population. Shout out to Catholic missionary Jean-Francis Bossuet-Secomte for going to see the Tunica and Natchez around 1699 and entering their sacred temple, quote, half by force, half by consent, after being fully told not to enter and that it was sacred. Shout out to Pierre Lemoyne Iberville and his crew, including Andre Pinico, for creating Fort Beloche, aka Fort Maurepas, out in Ocean Springs in the oyster season of 1699. They created the first temporary stronghold for France's interest in Bobancha. Shout out to Paul Deroux, who rolled with Iberville for 5 months as the official chaplain when he sailed from the Chandelier Islands to New Orleans area around 1700. Deroux documented the cruise expedition to establish a permanent settlement and detailed the sites along the way. On his little Eat, Pray, Write, he talks about eating pumpkins with a Bayou Gula. He watches a stickball game. He visits the Homo when they mourn the death of their chief. And he also watched someone kill an alligator without the gun. Also, with much shade, he eats bear, and this Jesuit tourist gets petty and complains about the food. No love to Jesuit Father Joseph de Limoges, who was supposed to hang out with the Homa, but seems to have been doing the least and lost all documentation of anything he did do when his boat flipped in the Mississippi in the 1700s. Shout out to Jacques Gravier, who actually made it down to around Alliance, Louisiana in the oyster season of 1701. Props to him for making a pretty detailed account of the people of locations that he countered in the lower Mississippi Valley with minimal religious shade. Shout out to the processes which sought dispossession. Shout out to the French, who established colony in the land of Mobile in 1702 and started leaving their stuff under armed guard in the lands of the Natchitoches in 1714. Shout out to Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Iberville and his brother, Bienville, who decided to post up in Mardi Gras season of 1718 and fully live in the shared seasonal indigenous gathering area, which also flooded 4 feet during the wet season each year. They rebranded their new spot as New Orleans after their sponsor. Shout out to Corpus Juris Civilis, Roman civil law based on the 12 Tables, which was adopted by Latin-based countries of France and Spain and then applied in Louisiana, making every French occupation project work a little different through civil law than places touched by English common law-based projects. Shout out to the French investors Delacour Vieux and the Compagnie de Occidental, and Captain Herpin of the Aurore. Shout out to the investor Galliard de Motte and Captain Ludouin of the Duc de Lemaine. These 2 ships trafficked the first groups of enslaved African people from Senegambia into the colonial fortress of New Orleans in 1719. Shout out to Jesuit Father Pierre Xavier de Charlevoix for coming down in 1721 and for using the guise of religion to begin dismantling the culture and fully functioning societies of North America. He came through to the Natchez, the Tunica, the Bayou Gula, and the Oma. He also mentions the Washita, Chata, Natchitoches, Chetimachi, Calapisa, Camberley, Tensaw, Chapatoulas, and Chahuachas. He passed all the way down to Passalute before heading to Biloxi. Shout out to Simon Page de Prats, an influencer/scholar who hung out in the Delta from 1700 to 1734. When he came, he rolled into New Orleans, bought a few Indian slaves, took a little land from the Acalapisas and a place a little past the Ursuline Bridge on Bayou St. John, and then played some IRL big game hunter up the Mississippi, shooting stuff while he headed to his new house in Natchez. He wrote the tome that would become the, quote, Louisiana colonial brand. Shout out to Sieur de Chapar for having the caucasity to request the whole city of White Apple, one of the largest indigenous civilizations in the lower Mississippi Valley, to move so he could plant more tobacco. By being a generally crappy person to literally everyone, he pushed the Natchez people, who were already pissed about the French slave system, to rise up for #landback around Black Friday of 1729. Shout out to the Choctaw, who had their own petty argument with the Natchez. So they used the opportunity to squad up with the French and in effect hand over the whole center of indigenous power to European powers through a brutal regional war. Shout out to Duc de Choiseul and Geronimo Grimaldi, who signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau on the sneak in a southern suburb of Paris during football season of 1762. This treaty ended the French and Indian War with the Natchez by somehow putting Spain in control of the indigenous held lands west of the Mississippi River, plus the colony of New Orleans. They did all of this without any representatives from North American delegation or any Calumet process present. Shout out to Duke Charles de la Choiseul, Geronimo Grimaldi, and this time also Duke of Bedford John Russell, who put ink on the Treaty of Paris in the Mardi Gras season of 1763, which hard-launched Spanish control over a bunch of French stuff. That stuff included, quote, everything which France possesses or ought to possess in North America. Again, this was done without any North American council, consent, or Calumet. Shout out to 1700s European fashion and how the interest in muskrat and beaver fur created a market for land and goods of Louisiana marshlands. Shout out to the Spanish land grant system, which allowed people to claim land if they had been there for 4 years, but you pretty much had to be part of the Catholic Church to do it. Shout out to the Congress of Confederation for slapping together the Land Ordinance of 1785, which outlined a United States system for square plots of land being owned by people coming together to create bigger squares that are towns, and how that became the norm across the whole base of the American project, even though it came out of New England. Shout out to Moreno Louise Uquejo and Louis Alexandre Berthier for putting together the Treaty of San Ildefonso in oyster season of 1800. This is where Spain did another trade seize with France and returned the indigenous lands branded as Louisiana to Napoleon Bonaparte. Again, all of this was done without North American council consent or Calumet. Shout out to Robert Livingston, James Monroe, and Francois Barbe-Maubois for going full send and signing the U.S. deed to buy the indigenous lands which had been branded Louisiana from Napoleon, right at the beginning of brown shrimp season in 1803. All this was done without any North American council consent or Calumet. Shout out to Spanish trade commissions for being such little shits that the Norentos, their name for the group of indigenous communities that dealt with both French and Spanish trading groups, sided with the U.S. after the 1804 Louisiana Purchase. The Norentos' support of the United States made U.S. dominion in the Gulf Coast more concrete. Shout out to the generations of indigenous people who hold the oral memory of land being sold under their feet as people rush to own their piece of the American dream. Shout out to the treaties. Shout out to the treaties. The treaties. Shout out to the treaties. Shout out to how essentially having a smoke and a barbecue with some French couch surfers turned into European nations doing the laundry and occupying the land and resources stewarded by existing North American civilizations. Shout out to the Pan-Turtle Island practice of collective pipe smoking and discussion as a relational and renewed process of diplomacy. Shout out to French Normans in Canada for naming this smoking practice the calumet because they thought it looked like a European musical instrument called the chalumeau. Shout out to Jacques Marquette for understanding and providing early detailed written descriptions of the importance of calumet that informed other explorers. Shout out for LaSalle for reading about Marquette, knowing how to use a calumet, but choosing to absolutely not respect what it meant. Shout out to St. Cant for using a calumet, only when convenient. Shout out for Tonty for using calumets when he lugged people around. Shout out to Charlemagne for witnessing and documenting calumets with the Natchez. Shout out for Iberville for making a fancy iron calumet in the shape of a ship and putting little beads on it and a fleur-de-lis. He writes about actively using this pipe to make himself and what he represents an ally with the Moshlagola, Washita, Churimacha, Yogashito, Balochi, Botibli, Oma, Pasabola, and the Theoclel. Shout out to the 8th United States Congress, who just said no in the Mardi Gras season of 1804 and decided that they couldn't be asked to uphold any of the calumet treaties that France and Spain had made with the people of the territory they now decided they owned. Shout out to the 9th U.S. Congressional Congress and Thomas Jefferson for organizing a bill, quote, respecting claims to lands in territories of Orleans and Louisiana in the late oyster season of 1807. Shout out to how the bill did the gymnastics of allowing anyone who lived on the land for consecutive years to claim it as theirs as long as they were a citizen of the colony. Shout out to how each parish got to pick their own land commissioner who chose who got land where. Shout out to how these commissioners had full and final say on what was proof of ownership, what was proof of occupation, and what was proof of citizenship with very little federal oversight. Shout out to how all this was done without any North American council consent or calumet. Shout out to the United States Court of Appeals 5th Circuit, who in the deer season of 1982 thought it was okay for Judge W. Eugene Davis to preside over a case to address Chitimacha Aboriginal land rights when the judge's close homies and his ex-employer Texaco would be directly negatively impacted by his judgment. Dispossession is ongoing. Shout out to Louisiana's first civil code adopted in 1808 as a state. Shout out to how recession for lesion beyond moiety is supposed to protect people from having their land swindled, but there's so much oral history of indigenous Gulf South communities signing away lands for pennies. Shout out to Angola, aka Louisiana State Penitentiary, for posting up in an old Homa and Tunica village and exasperating the loss of communion with land by perpetuating chattel slavery. Shout out to Louisiana Tax Code for having some of the lowest taxes on outgoing petrochemical trade, leading to the loss of land itself through saltwater intrusion and industrial terraforming. Shout out to Louisiana's 50-year plan, which includes the systemic removal of everyone and everything south of I-10 so the land can be exploited for industrial uses. Shout out to the Quai Branly Museum in Paris for having Gulf South stuff, but not allowing the stuff to continue to be in relation with the communities who are actively living in the Gulf South. Welcome to our home and welcome to our work. You can be in relation by checking out more things that were talked about in the Shoutout. You can be in relation by giving a read to The Great Power of Small Nations by Liz Ellis. You can be in relation by incorporating what we've compiled into your own storytelling and educating. You can be in relation by speaking in present tense and not saying, this was the land of the. Indigenous people are still here. Say, this is the land of the. You can be in relation by contributing to Wabancha as a place of extraordinary linguistic, social, and political diversity. You can be in relation by helping us maintain the indigenous cultures of refugee asylum, collective barbecues, cross-cultural communication, and fluid, autonomous, multinational communities. You can be in relation by knowing the past as it helps us build the present. Funding by the National Performance Network afforded us the time, and a studio in the woods provided us the access to read and review the sources to compile this document. Thank you so much for your relation in this work.